Well, thank you for your talk. This is fascinating and it raises lots of questions. In fact, I think in some respects, before we open up this to the audience for questions, I just wanted to sort of start off with a lead question, and I was wondering, but you undercut my question in a certain way with your really the substance in your talk. But I was curious about, you mentioned early on the research process. And it had me wonder, as you do your research around this person, you discover lots of things about her and her place in society and the structural inequities that she had to face, and which results in an archive that is biased. So you learn a lot about her. And you've entitled your talk, you use the word identity in your talk. You say, Martines' identity. I'd like to provocatively begin by asking you in what ways Martines has helped to shape your identity as a performer and scholar. Are there ways in the process of having done research on her that she has ended up teaching you a few things about how you shape your own career? What does the research process tell you about her position in society, and then in turn how she might shape your thinking as you move ahead?
I think any kind of research will influence you professionally as well. I think the interesting thing about the research process with Martines is sort of how it differs from the more well-known canon composers. Okay. I talked a bit about the archive, and in fact here again I'm borrowing from post-colonial studies, even though this is not a post-colonial topic, but looking at the archive in multiple ways, looking at what the dominant narratives are, but then also trying to question what is not being said. And it's this idea of reading the archive along the grain and against the grain to see where the silences are. Indeed. And as a performer, I suppose Martines has influenced me in that I feel encouraged to take more license with playing her music. And not just her music, but really any music from that time. I very briefly talked about the embellishments in the G minor sonata. And in the process of researching her pieces, I realized that at the time when this kind of music was performed, improvisation upon repetition in a piece, or improvisation in general, improvisation of embellishments especially, was expected of any performer. Yet with the deification of Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, nowadays performers have gone away from that, because we look at the printed score as the Holy Grail, the Bible or something like that, and it must not be altered in the slightest. Yet that is not how Mozart or anyone at the time would have performed it. And I feel that Martines and other, for now, lesser known composers give you an opportunity to maybe suggest to audiences, educate people maybe a little bit on performance practices of the time, because there is not this listening expectation. When I'm playing a piece by Martines, not everyone in the audience is like, oh, okay, I'm thinking of X and Y, a reference recording, let's see how this compares. But rather, probably the fewest people will know the piece, and thereby I have the freedom to play with the music and the way it would have been done in the 18th century, add my own ideas and flavor to it.
Thank you.
Please. This thing that you pointed out, is it because the music is now regarded as a work that, embellishments or this thing are, interpretations are out, but it's a sacrosanct work which cannot then be transgressed upon?
I think it also has to do with how music developed in the subsequent centuries. So as we go into the 19th and 20th centuries, composers became increasingly precise with how they wrote things down, and if you skip forward to someone like Stravinsky, he really wanted the performer to only be a medium, but individual flavors should not be added. It was, this is the text and you're supposed to be the medium for the text to be transported to the audience. And I think nowadays performers are very much still in this type of thinking, even for earlier music, even for music where this approach may not be the most appropriate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Please.
And I have a couple of questions in this matter. Now, one is, just by looking at the music, and you take away the names of the composers, and obviously people who read music will know Mozart or something like that. But just by looking at her music, would you say, are there any ways of knowing that this was written by her?
I don't think so, no.
No. Because in poetry in the other arts, there is normally an engraving or a way of melding in the self into the, not just of the narrative, but of the ideas. And you say that is there. The second question I had, it's not a question, it's a comment. Even in subcontinental traditions, you have the woman who performs. Normally there are two types of women, right? One is the kawaii, the courtesan. The other is the yogini, who's also free. She is the ascetic. So is your body available to everyone for a price, or is it only available to God? It seems to be this kind of choice a woman needs to make her body when she chooses. And of course, in a noble household of the kind that Martines belonged, transferring that context, as it were, here. Of course, women will have a tremendously difficult time in whichever century, recently, that will come up after the name of being liberty. It's always this. And the great silence of the woman's body and the woman's voice. I'm not trying to make this a proto-feminist argument, but these are the paradigms within which I think we need to do this, don't you think?
Absolutely, I agree. And one of the interesting things about Martines is, I think, that the way she navigated this divide, here maybe not so much between being a courtesan or being a priestess, but between the private and the public. And I talked a bit about it in my lecture recitals. The salons that she hosted were one of the ways she navigated this, because they were this liminal space, this gray zone between the private and the public. But it was always a balancing act for, as we know from many sources of the time, making a spectacle of yourself was deemed very improper for a woman, and women performers who chose to perform publicly usually did not come from aristocratic families.
In your research, did you come across any evidence at all that she herself was frustrated with her situation, that she felt any unfairness, or that she was just taking these things for granted as normal?
That's a very difficult question, especially because so many of the sources have not survived, and it would have, and anyway, not many sources would have survived, but even more so because there were various fires in Vienna that destroyed libraries and archives. With her, we can only guess at it in various comments that we find in her letters, like when she refers to the weakness of her sex in a letter. We have to question in what way did she mean that. We don't have any obvious evidence of her being frustrated. Rather, it seems that she made use of all and every opportunity that she had without ever breaking her societal standards and without ever transgressing.
Smart woman.
You had a question?
Well, it's also related to your research methodology, because you said you are
approaching her as a feminist. And yet you don't want to fall into the trap of just imagining that she was a feminist, to be fair. But in your talk, you also said that the material that you have to work with is very, very minimal. Program notes which are not very reliable, a lot of things that got burnt away in libraries and so on. So how are you going to get at the meat of the substance to know how you will place her as a feminist, non-feminist? Other than the fact that her music speaks to her genius, this particular feminism approach seems to be problematic in practice.
Yeah, I think from when I say I approach it as a feminist, it also relates to the kinds of aspects I want to shine a light upon. So a traditional musicological thesis would maybe just focus on analyzing the musical structures of her pieces and saying, oh, this is a sonata form and it is it manifests in XYZ way. But I'm interested in questions about identity, and I think when we look at identity from a feminist point of view, we also need to consider maybe other aspects that we don't immediately think of when we talk about identity, like the surrounding circumstances, the relationships that do shape our identities. With regards to the sources, there are sort of two different source sets. On one hand, there are the primary sources like the actual musical scores, letters that have survived, and then there's the other set that speaks to the reception of Martinez's life and her music, like the program notes that were written, also earlier texts. I didn't mention this in the talk, but even in the 19th century, some people spoke about Martinez, and in fact there was one notable woman in Vienna, Madame Pichler, who sort of talked about her rather disparagingly and said, oh, Martinez, she really couldn't compose. And then everyone copied her opinion, and this is one of the reasons why Martinez was forgotten for a long time and only now is being rediscovered, and we're discovering that actually her music is amazing. Yes.
She was a musician, a composer, but also a singer.
Yes.
She wrote her own lyrics in the songs.
So she actually exclusively used texts by Metastasia.
So she never wrote her own songs.
No, but that was quite common at the time to use other people's songs. This idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the whole the artwork that is exclusively created by one sort of springs up later in the 19th century, and especially with Wagner. Yes, he did it all, writing the librettos, writing the music, staging everything. But during Martinez's days, it was very much the common practice to use text from a librettist, and Metastasia was probably the best, so she used his text.
Yeah, nothing nowhere in that text does it refer to her or any type of person she was, her feelings, her impressions, her good states or bad states?
Not necessarily. I mean, the librettos that Metastasia wrote were often about, I don't know, like historic figures or dealing with the plays, abstract topics. But it is interesting to note that his female characters were usually quite strong, or at least relatively empowered, at least compared to Da Ponte, another famous librettist of the time, whose women are usually not depicted in a very flattering way.
Considering her aristocratic background, one couldn't really expect such beautiful creation from her, but she did create so much beauty. So what, according to you, considering nature versus nurture, was it her raw talent, or was it her upbringing, something about, since you've read about her life, what was it? Was it a combination? What must have sparked that and created such beauty?
I mean, hard to say. We probably will never figure out the nature versus nurture debate, but presumably it was some kind of inherent talent that then was nurtured, and it was very much common practice for women of the upper middle class or aristocracy to receive general musical training. So Antonia, her sister, also had piano lessons, singing lessons, etc., etc. But apparently something in Martines was special, and she was a lot more successful with her music than Antonia. We don't know if Antonia would have wanted the same kind of non-career that Marianna Martines had, but it's hard to tell.
Is there any kind of move to go to, towards improvising, as you just said, that you don't become very strict with the music that is written? Are more musicians today trying to improvise, classical works in their own way? Is that being done, or is it still, for both of them? So,
I think maybe slowly we're seeing a bit of a development towards more improvisation within the canon pieces as well. There are of course different camps, and one of the hindering aspects I think is competition culture, because if you go to a piano competition, there is the one way to play a piece, and you don't know.
That is the difference between Western classical and Indian classical. Indian classical is almost totally improvisation. We have a few rules and then everything is up to you. Very much stick to what the written work is.
Yes. Maybe we should learn some lessons from Indian classical music.
I think that would be nice.
Yeah.
To be able to, let the current this thing of performers bring out their own style or their own feelings into the music that is written by the masters.
Yes, indeed. I
it can
completely
only be
agree.
reinterpreted.
But you do have people like Glenn Gould, where the interpretation is very strong in that sense, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I mean, even if someone decides to play just what is written on the score, you can still have a highly individual interpretation of a piece. It's just with this particular kind of music, you could have so much more freedom and so many more opportunities to add your personality to a piece.
In fact, in jazz music, that famous Take 5 by Dave Brubeck, I came across a Pakistani rendition of it, and the main tune is played by a Pakistani flute, a bamboo flute, and it's completely different. It has a different quality altogether. And I was wondering how they could record that and what sort of legal hurdles there would be, because this is a different piece of music and it's so strongly.
I mean, jazz is a completely different world again. I'm not a jazz performer, though I love listening to jazz. I only know that is very much the common practice, that you have these standards, these songs, and every jazz musician takes these standard songs and creates their own work of art with them.
Let's have a couple more questions, and I've got want to keep us on time because we've also got dinner. So, a couple more questions.
So, was her work published and performed beyond the salon in her time, or was it just restricted to?
Yes. So, interestingly, some of her work was actually published, which is quite rare, even for non-women composers. So the two sonatas in E and A major, they were published by Ulrich Hafner, who was a collector of music, a music publisher, and he had this raccolta musicale, it's called. It's a few volumes of cembalo, harpsichord music. And Martines is the only woman included in this collection, and all the others are Kapellmeister, Maestro da Camera, whatever. And then Martines, and she is referred to of Dilettante de Vienne. So a dilettante from Vienna. Again, making sure that she is not referred to as a professional composer.
Question?
Yeah, can I take you back to the beginning? What?
If you could speak up just a bit so the people at the back can hear. Thanks.
Can I take you back to the beginning? What sparked your interest in Martinez? He was not a very popular composer, musician. But where did that seed start in you that made you want to, devote your career, your performances to her?
Yeah, so my first contact with her was actually because of this first Salzburg performance of the piano concerto in A major. At the time, I was at the Mozarteum Salzburg studying, and the head of the Institute for Diversity and Gender Studies approached me and asked me, would you be interested in playing this concert? I had never heard of Martinez until then. And I started playing the piece and was just amazed by how beautiful this music is. And from there, it just continued.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody?
Maybe one final question.
One final question? In the back? Anybody?
Taking on from what you just asked, I love that question. It's resonated with me as well. What do you intend to do in future with this knowledge, and what amazing heritage, I would say, that you have sort of received? And with all that experience, how would you like to take it ahead?
I mean, the short-term plan is now just to finish up my DPhil at Oxford. But I mean, eventually I would like Martinez to be really well known, and I guess the bigger picture is that I want the so-called canon of Western classical music to be overhauled, because currently it's just a bunch of white men composers, and there's so many wonderful pieces we're missing out on, really. So after Martinez, maybe I will also engage with a few other of the forgotten women or otherwise minority composers. I think there's so much to discover, and it's actually really exciting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So,
like the Viennese salons. It's really interesting that we get to see somebody most of us haven't heard of, and in this detailed way, and you play her work and you're researching her life, and it's inspiring in many ways. So thanks, Judith. Thanks for sharing your work with us. Both your performance, both your piano playing and your research. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks.